Imagine sitting in a quiet hospital room, holding the hand of someone you love, listening to the steady rhythm of a machine that is supposed to mean hope, not fear. The doctor walks in with calm confidence, the kind that makes you believe everything will be okay, the kind of voice you trust without question. For families across the United States, men and women in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, that trust is everything. It is the difference between despair and belief, between giving up and holding on. And for years, one man built his entire reputation on that trust. He was known as Dr. Daniel Harper, a respected cancer specialist who treated hundreds of patients, many of whom believed he was their last chance. He spoke with certainty, prescribed aggressive treatments, and assured families he was doing everything possible. But something didn't feel right to everyone. Some patients didn't just fail to recover, they got worse in ways no one could explain. Their conditions declined rapidly, faster than expected, leaving loved ones confused and desperate for answers. At first, it was easy to believe it was just the nature of the disease, the cruel unpredictability of cancer itself. But as time went on, patterns began to form, quiet concerns whispered between nurses, families asking questions that never seemed to get clear answers. And what started as doubt slowly turned into something far more serious, something that would eventually shake the very foundation of trust placed in the medical system. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time concerns about Dr. Daniel Harper began to surface, they didn't arrive all at once. They came quietly, almost politely, in the form of second opinions, uneasy conversations, and questions that lingered longer than they should have. Families started comparing notes, noticing similarities they couldn't ignore. Patients who had walked into his office with hope were declining at a pace that didn't make sense, even to those familiar with the harsh realities of cancer. Some were told their condition was far worse than they had previously believed, pushed into immediate and aggressive treatments that left them weaker, sicker, and in some cases, beyond recovery in a matter of months. Medical files began to tell stories that words could not fully explain, patterns hidden in plain sight, overlooked because no one wanted to question a man with his reputation. Hospitals rely on trust, and in a system built on expertise and authority, few people think to challenge the very person tasked with saving lives. Dr. Daniel Harper had credentials, experience, and the confidence of his peers, which made the growing doubts even harder to accept. Was this simply a case of misjudgment, an unfortunate series of aggressive treatments in difficult cases, or was something else happening beneath the surface? How did so many warning signs go unnoticed for so long? And why did it take multiple families speaking out before anyone began to connect the dots? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how many patients had already been affected before anyone started asking the right questions? What investigators would eventually uncover would shake the medical community to its core, forcing people to confront a reality they never imagined possible. Long before the questions, before the quiet doubts and uneasy conversations, Dr. Daniel Harper was the kind of man people pointed to as proof that hard work could change everything. He grew up in a modest neighborhood in the Midwest, raised in a household where discipline and perseverance were not just encouraged, they were expected. His father worked long hours in a factory. His mother balanced multiple jobs, and from an early age, Daniel understood what it meant to earn your place in the world. He was focused, determined, and by all accounts, brilliant. Teachers described him as disciplined beyond his years, the kind of student who didn't just meet expectations but quietly exceeded them. By the time he entered medical school, there was little doubt among those who knew him that he would go far. He graduated near the top of his class, earned recognition for his clinical skills, and quickly developed a reputation for precision and confidence. When he chose oncology, the field of medicine dedicated to treating cancer, it seemed almost fitting. It was a specialty that required not only intelligence but emotional strength, and Daniel Harper appeared to have both. As his career progressed, He became known as a doctor who took control of difficult cases, someone who didn't shy away from aggressive treatment plans when others hesitated. Patients and their families often described him as direct, even firm, but reassuring in a way that made you believe he knew exactly what he was doing. For many, especially those in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, facing one of the most frightening diagnoses imaginable, that confidence was everything. People like Robert and Linda Hayes, a couple in their early 60s, who had built a quiet life together and were suddenly forced to confront a reality they never expected. When Linda was diagnosed, they were terrified, but when they met Dr. Daniel Harper, something shifted. He spoke clearly, outlined a plan, and gave them a sense of direction in a moment that felt completely out of control. Then there was Michael Turner, a 54-year-old father of three, who had always been the strong one in his family, now sitting in a hospital room trying to process how his life had changed overnight. For him, Dr. Harper represented hope, a chance to fight back, a reason to believe that there was still time. And for a while, everything seemed exactly as it should. Treatments were scheduled, medications were administered, and Dr. Daniel Harper remained at the center of it all, guiding each decision with authority. But even in those early stages, there were moments, small enough to dismiss, subtle enough to overlook, where something didn't feel entirely right. A nurse hesitating before carrying out an order, a family member asking a question that didn't quite get answered, a treatment plan that seemed unusually aggressive compared to what others had heard. These moments passed quickly, often buried under the urgency of the situation, because when you are fighting for your life, you don't always have the luxury of doubt. You trust the person in front of you, the one wearing the white coat, the one telling you what needs to be done. Still, those small irregularities began to linger, forming the faint outline of a pattern that no one was ready to fully acknowledge. And as more patients placed their lives in the hands of Dr. Daniel Harper, the sense that something wasn't quite adding up grew just enough to be felt, but not yet enough to be proven. At first, nothing about the treatments administered by Dr. Daniel Harper seemed unusual to those who trusted him. Cancer is unpredictable, often aggressive, and in many cases, the line between progress and decline can blur without warning. Patients like Linda Hayes began their treatment with cautious optimism, holding on to every word Dr. Harper said as if it were a promise. The medications were strong, the procedures demanding, but they were told this was necessary, that fighting cancer required intensity. Robert Hayes watched his wife endure round after round of treatment, her strength fatting faster than he had expected, but each time he raised a concern, he was reassured that this was part of the process. Across town, Michael Turner was going through something similar. His energy dropped rapidly, his condition shifting in ways that didn't match what he had been told to expect. Still, he trusted Dr. Daniel Harper, believing that every setback was simply part of a larger plan to get better. But as weeks turned into months, those setbacks became harder to ignore. Linda's condition didn't just stall, it declined at a pace that left her family struggling to understand what was happening. Robert began to notice that each new treatment seemed to take more from her than it gave back. The woman who had once been full of life now spent most of her days exhausted, her body reacting in ways that felt disproportionate even for someone battling cancer. When Robert asked questions, the answers he received were technical, complex, and often delivered with a level of certainty that made it difficult to challenge them. Meanwhile, Michael Turner found himself in a similar position. His symptoms intensified, new complications appearing without clear explanation. His children began to worry, quietly discussing whether they should seek another opinion, but the idea of questioning a specialist like Dr. Daniel Harper felt almost unthinkable. After all, this was the man they had been told was one of the best. Then there were others, patients whose stories followed a pattern that was only visible when viewed together. Middle-aged men and women, each placing their trust in Dr. Harper, each undergoing aggressive treatment plans, and each experiencing a decline that seemed unusually rapid. Some developed severe reactions shortly after procedures, Others found their diagnoses escalating in ways that didn't align with earlier assessments. Families began to notice similarities, but those observations were often dismissed as coincidence. Cancer, they were told, does not follow a predictable path. It was an explanation that made sense, at least on the surface, and one that many accepted because the alternative was far more difficult to confront. Still, the unease grew, quietly spreading from one case to another, building in the spaces between unanswered questions and unexplained outcomes. For Robert Hayes, the turning point came during a routine visit, one that should have been like any other. He sat across from Dr. Daniel Harper, listening as another adjustment to Linda's treatment plan was explained in careful detail. But this time, something felt different. The confidence in the doctor's voice, the certainty in his recommendations, no longer brought comfort. Instead, it raised a question Robert had been avoiding for weeks. It wasn't a medical question, not at first. It was something simpler, something more direct, something that cut through all the technical language and went straight to the heart of what he was witnessing. And in that moment, as he looked at the man he had trusted with his wife's life, Robert asked a question that would change everything. Robert Hayes' question did not bring the clarity he was hoping for. Instead, it created a silence that lingered just long enough to be uncomfortable. Dr. Daniel Harper responded with the same composed confidence he always had, offering a detailed explanation that, on the surface, sounded reasonable. But this time, it didn't settle the unease. It amplified it. Robert left that appointment with something he hadn't felt before, not just fear for his wife, but doubt about the man guiding her treatment. And he wasn't alone. Around the same time, other families were beginning to reach similar conclusions, each one triggered by a moment that didn't sit right, a response that felt rehearsed, or a treatment outcome that defied expectations in the worst possible way. As more patients experienced rapid declines, complaints began to surface, first quietly within hospital walls, then more formally through internal channels. Nurses who had worked closely with Dr. Daniel Harper started noticing patterns they couldn't ignore. Certain medications were being administered more aggressively than usual, dosages that seemed unusually high, treatment plans that escalated faster than standard protocols would suggest. Some staff members raised concerns, documenting what they observed, hoping it would prompt a review. But in a system built on hierarchy, questioning a senior specialist was not something that happened easily. Reports were filed, discussions were held behind closed doors, but no immediate action was taken. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The idea that a respected cancer doctor could be at the center of something so troubling was difficult to accept. Outside the hospital, the situation was beginning to attract attention. Families, desperate for answers, started comparing experiences more openly. Medical records were requested, second opinions sought, and what they found only deepened the mystery. Some independent doctors reviewing these cases expressed confusion over the treatment approaches used by Dr. Daniel Harper. There were inconsistencies, decisions that didn't align with widely accepted practices, and outcomes that raised more questions than answers. Still, alternative explanations were considered. Could it be a series of misdiagnoses, unfortunate but not impossible in complex cancer cases? Was there an issue with the medication itself, perhaps a faulty batch affecting multiple patients? Or could the hospital system have failed in some way, allowing errors to go unnoticed? Each possibility offered a way to make sense of what was happening without confronting the most disturbing explanation. Meanwhile, internal pressure within the hospital began to grow. A small group of staff members pushed for a deeper investigation, compiling data from multiple cases, looking for connections that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. When those numbers were finally placed side by side, the pattern became harder to ignore. Patients under Dr. Daniel Harper's care were declining at a rate that stood apart from others in similar conditions. Treatment timelines, symptom progression, and outcomes began to form a picture that was deeply unsettling. But even then, hesitation remained. Accusing a doctor of wrongdoing is not a simple step. especially when lives, reputations, and legal consequences are all at stake. Still, the evidence was building piece by piece, and the more it grew, the harder it became to look away. Because no matter how many explanations were considered, no matter how much doubt remained, one fact stood out with increasing clarity. The numbers didn't lie. As the pressure mounted, what had once been quiet concern turned into a formal investigation that could no longer be contained within hospital walls. External authorities were brought in, and for the first time, Dr. Daniel Harper was no longer just a respected physician under internal review. He was now the subject of a deeper inquiry. Investigators began with what they had: patient records, treatment logs, prescription histories, and timelines that stretched back years. At first, the data seemed complex, even overwhelming, but as they worked through it piece by piece, patterns began to emerge with unsettling clarity. Treatments that deviated from standard protocols, dosages that appeared unusually aggressive, and decisions that, when viewed in isolation, could be explained, but when placed side by side, formed a sequence that was difficult to justify. Dr. Daniel Harper was called in to answer questions, and those who sat across from him expected confidence, the same composed authority he had shown patients and colleagues for years. And at first, that is exactly what he gave them. His responses were measured, detailed, and grounded in medical language that made it difficult to challenge him directly. But as investigators pressed further, asking about specific cases, specific decisions, and specific outcomes, subtle shifts began to appear. There were moments where his answers became less direct, where timelines didn't align as clearly as they should have, where explanations that once sounded convincing began to feel incomplete. It wasn't a dramatic breakdown, nothing that could be pointed to immediately as proof of wrongdoing, but it was enough to raise more questions than it answered. At the same time, more information was coming to light from within the hospital itself. Staff members who had once hesitated to speak were now being asked directly about what they had seen, what they had documented, and what they had chosen to overlook. Some described instances where they felt uncomfortable carrying out certain orders. Others recalled conversations that, in hindsight, seemed more significant than they realized at the time. There were reports of treatment adjustments made without clear justification, notes that had been altered or updated after the fact, and gaps in documentation that should not have existed in a system designed to track every detail of patient care. Each piece on its own could be explained, but together, they began to form a narrative that was increasingly difficult to ignore. As investigators continued to connect these details, a clearer picture of Dr. Daniel Harper's practices began to take shape. It wasn't just about aggressive treatment anymore. It was about consistency in decisions that seemed to push patients toward outcomes that raised serious concern. The more they uncovered, the more the focus shifted from whether mistakes had been made to whether those actions followed a pattern that pointed to something intentional. And as that possibility came into focus, the tone of the investigation changed. This was no longer just a review of medical judgment. It was an effort to understand motive, to determine whether there was a reason behind the choices that had affected so many lives. By this point, Dr. Daniel Harper was no longer just responding to questions. He was reacting to them. The calm confidence that once defined him was now accompanied by visible tension, brief pauses, and moments where his answers seemed carefully constructed rather than naturally given. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his timeline, small contradictions that, when revisited, became harder to reconcile. The man who had once appeared so certain now seemed increasingly guarded, aware that every word carried weight. And just as the investigation reached a critical point, when the pieces were beginning to align in a way that could no longer be dismissed, something else surfaced, something that shifted the entire direction of the case. But what they discovered next was far more disturbing than anyone expected. What investigators uncovered next did not come from a single piece of evidence, but from a combination of details that, when placed together, revealed something no one had been prepared to face. It began with a closer examination of the treatments themselves, not just how they were administered, but why certain decisions had been made in the first place. Independent medical experts were brought in to review Dr. Daniel Harper's patient files, and what they found raised immediate concern. In multiple cases, patients had been diagnosed with more advanced stages of cancer than subsequent reviews could confirm. Treatment plans were not only aggressive, they were, in some instances, unnecessary at the level they were prescribed. Medications were administered in combinations and dosages that went beyond what many specialists would consider appropriate, especially for patients whose conditions did not justify such intensity. As this analysis continued, another layer began to emerge, one that shifted the focus from medical judgment to possible intent. Financial records tied to Dr. Daniel Harper's practice revealed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. Certain treatments, particularly the most aggressive and costly ones, were being prescribed at a significantly higher rate under his care than under other physicians in similar roles. Insurance claims reflected repeated billing for complex procedures, some of which were later questioned by external reviewers. The connection between these financial incentives and the treatment decisions being made began to form a narrative that was deeply troubling. It suggested that the choices affecting patients like Linda Hayes and Michael Turner may not have been driven solely by medical necessity. For the families, the realization came slowly, almost too heavy to process all at once. Robert Hayes sat with the knowledge that the treatments his wife had endured, the ones he had trusted without hesitation, might not have been what they were presented to be. The decline he had witnessed, the suffering that had seemed like an unavoidable part of the illness, now carried a different weight. Across multiple cases, similar reactions unfolded. Families revisited every moment, every decision, questioning whether things could have been different if they had known what was happening. The sense of betrayal ran deeper than anger. It was personal, built on the trust they had placed in a man who had positioned himself as their guide through the most difficult time of their lives. Investigators also identified a pattern in how Dr. Daniel Harper communicated with his patients. He often presented limited options, steering individuals toward specific treatments while minimizing alternatives that may have been less invasive. In some cases, second opinions were discouraged, framed as unnecessary delays in critical care. This level of control over decision-making created an environment where patients felt they had little choice but to follow his recommendations, reinforcing the authority he held over every aspect of their treatment. When viewed alongside the medical and financial findings, this behavior added another dimension to the case, one that pointed not just to questionable decisions, but to a consistent approach that influenced outcomes in a very specific direction. By the time these elements were brought together, the image of Dr. Daniel Harper had changed completely. The respected specialist, the confident voice of reassurance, was now at the center of a case that challenged everything people believed about the role of a doctor. In court, the evidence was presented piece by piece, each detail adding to a story that was difficult to hear and even harder to accept. Families listened as the facts were laid out, as the patterns were explained, and as the full extent of what had happened began to take shape in a public setting. The emotional impact of that moment could not be measured in simple terms. It was seen in the faces of those who had trusted him, in the silence that followed each revelation, in the weight of understanding that settled over the room. And at the center of it all was a single, undeniable truth that no explanation could soften. The man they trusted with their lives had broken the very oath he swore to uphold. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was finally read, the kind of silence that carries the weight of everything that led up to that moment. Dr. Daniel Harper sat still, no longer the commanding presence he once was, but a man facing the full consequences of decisions that had altered countless lives. The charges reflected what investigators had spent months uncovering, a pattern of actions that went beyond poor judgment and crossed into deliberate misconduct. For the families, including Robert Hayes, there was no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had finally been recognized. Justice, in its legal form, had taken shape, but it did little to undo what had already been done. Linda Hayes was no longer there to see that moment, and for Robert, that absence was more powerful than anything said inside that courtroom. In the weeks that followed, the impact of the case spread far beyond a single hospital. Medical boards reviewed policies, institutions began examining their own systems, and questions were raised about how someone like Dr. Daniel Harper had been able to operate without earlier intervention. Records showed that concerns had surfaced before, subtle warnings that, if taken seriously, might have changed the outcome for patients like Michael Turner and others. Instead, those early signs had been minimized, delayed, or lost within a system that often relies on trust until something forces it to do otherwise. The hospital where he once practiced became a place marked by what had happened, its reputation tied to a case that many wished had been handled differently. For the victims and their families, the aftermath was not defined by legal conclusions, but by the reality they were left to live with. They revisited memories with a new understanding, moments that once carried hope now shadowed by doubt. Conversations that had seemed reassuring were reconsidered, decisions that had been made with trust now questioned in ways that could not be undone. The emotional weight of that realization stayed with them, not just as grief, but as a lingering sense that something had been taken from them under the belief that it was being protected. Across the country, people followed the story and found themselves asking difficult questions about the systems they rely on, about the balance between trust and accountability in places where lives are at stake. And as the case of Dr. Daniel Harper came to a close in the public eye, the questions it raised did not fade with it. Could this have been prevented if those early concerns had been addressed differently, if the hesitation to challenge authority had been set aside sooner? Who is truly accountable in a situation where one person's actions are enabled by a structure that failed to act when it mattered most? These are the questions that remain, long after the verdict is delivered, shaping how stories like this are remembered and how future ones might be changed. In the quiet moments after the trial, families like Robert and Linda Hayes found themselves grappling with feelings that were harder to measure than any legal ruling. The anger, the grief, the disbelief, all of it intertwined with the memories of the moments when they had believed completely in the man who held their loved ones' lives in his hands. Michael Turner thought back to every appointment, every recommendation, every word from Dr. Daniel Harper, and he realized how fragile trust can be when placed in a single individual, even one with the highest credentials. For decades, people have relied on institutions, on professionals whose authority we rarely question, and in doing so, we give up a measure of control over our own safety and well-being. It is a reliance that makes life possible, but also one that leaves room for mistakes, for oversights, and in rare cases, for betrayal. The aftermath of Dr. Daniel Harper's actions was not only measured in the courtroom or in policy changes, but in the quiet, personal reckonings of those who had entrusted their lives to him. Families revisited the ways they had interpreted every word, every gesture, every decision, often wondering how much they had missed simply because they had trusted too fully. And yet that trust, however broken, is part of the human experience, necessary for love, for healing, for the courage to face life's greatest challenges. The lesson here is not simply about one doctor or one case, but about the importance of awareness, of asking difficult questions, of paying attention to the subtle signs that something might be amiss. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones we never think to question. It is a reminder that vigilance, combined with empathy, is what protects us in a world where even those with the most authority can fall short. As we reflect on everything that happened with Dr. Daniel Harper, it's impossible not to ask yourself some difficult questions. Do you think warning signs were missed, or were they simply ignored? Could the tragedies experienced by families like the Hayes and the Turners have been prevented if someone had paid closer attention, asked harder questions, or challenged authority sooner? These are the conversations that need to be had, because they affect not just a single case, but the way we think about trust, responsibility, and accountability in every institution we rely on. Have you or someone you know ever experienced something like this, where someone you trusted with your life or your well-being let you down in ways you never expected? We want to hear your thoughts and your stories, because understanding these moments helps all of us to be more aware, more cautious, and more empowered. And if you think this case was shocking, wait until you hear what happened in our next story. It is even more unbelievable. Make sure to subscribe for more real-life stories that challenge what we think we know, because these are the lessons that stay with us long after the headlines fade.